Hello, hello. Just going to give it a minute or two for attendees to join in. And good morning if you're on the West Coast. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. So while we're waiting for some additional folks to be let into the room, for those of you who may be new to us, nice to see you. I'm Michelle Ruiz, and I am the CEO and one of the founders of Bias Inc. We are talking about Islamophobia in the workplace. Today, we call it part two because we addressed, this is part of our larger series around religious bias in the workplace, and some would refer to it as faith-based bias. And part one was focused on anti-Semitism in the workplace. So this is part two of this series, and here at Bias Inc, we focus on helping organizations to create more fair and respectful workplaces. So to tell you a little bit more about what we do, we offer bias training. We also offer diagnostics related to equity, inclusion, cultural humility. We also do implicit bias mitigation. So we have a series of tools and solutions for organizations to deploy in their workplaces. So we have these virtual conversations periodically. So I'm delighted to introduce our experts today, Dr. Nadia Ansari. And Dr. Ansari is one of our experts in our curriculum on faith-based and religious-based bias. So if you're already a client, you've deployed our faith-based module and diagnostics, you'll likely recognize her. If not, you will see her if you would like to deploy or like more information. Dr. Ansari is an expert in bias-based bullying, cyberbullying, Islamophobia, and the psychological impacts of bullying. She's a well-published author related to publications in these areas, and she has participated in media presentations and other areas, sharing her expertise in this topic. And so I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Ansari to our virtual conversation today. So Dr. Ansari, and by the way, I'm mentioning the date simply because we are, we do offer this on demand. We also will be putting this on our Bias Inc YouTube channel. I just want to mention we're recording this in January of 2025, and there's a lot going on in the world as it pertains to the uptick that we have seen in religious-based bias. And to just kind of set the stage, there's been a lot of media coverage around anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism, in particular since the October 7, 2023 attack that occurred in Israel, and then everything that has transpired since then. We also know the research is very clear that when anti-Semitism goes up, Islamophobia also goes up. And the statistics are very clear on that. And it is rooted in what we would call, actually, there's intersectionality. It's religious-based bias, it's faith-based bias, it's ethnic-based bias, it's country of origin-based bias. There's a lot of intersection related to that. So while we may hear a lot more at this moment in time about the anti-Semitism piece, it's important for workplace leaders to recognize that Islamophobia, there's a very direct correlation in the rise, and the statistics are there. And in fact, Dr. Ansari, perhaps you can start by kind of sharing, what the trends are at the moment in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the rise of Islamophobia.
Thank you, Michelle. It's very clear, as you said, that the data are mounting and showing that Islamophobia is alive and well. And especially after October 7th, as you said, we've seen rises in hate speech, hate crimes, etc., directed at both the Jewish American and Muslim American populations. And so this isn't a new trend. This is a trend that's consistent in that when there is typically political unrest, wars, tension involving the Middle East, we typically see a rise in those indicators of bias and discrimination.
Hmm. And obviously the tragic events that have been happening in the Middle East have contributed to what we've seen in the rise in both of these types of intolerance. But also politics have a lot to do with that. And so if we just kind of go back, you and I were talking the other day, 9/11, we saw a significant rise in Islamophobia after 9/11. And we also have seen it historically during, different administrations. And so we should expect that this rise is going to continue. In other words, that we as leaders need to understand that this is a real risk in your organization. Is there something else that you would like to add or contribute related to that?
I think that I completely agree with what you said, and we have to be uh, careful, and we also have to recognize that this is not going to plateau anytime soon or decline anytime soon. The events in the Middle East are, it's clear that they've continued, and they will continue for some time, of course. And so it's not necessarily an international conflict. It's something that does impact American society. And whatever's happening in society winds up oftentimes playing out in the workplace because workplaces, organizations are microcosms of society. And so we have to be aware of that, and we have to work proactively to recognize that both the Jewish and Muslim communities are at risk or vulnerable to hate incidents, marginalization at work, exclusion, as well as microaggressions on a very sort of minor level. But those we find in the psychological literature on the outcomes of bias. We know that even frequent microaggressions they do take a toll on one's mental health. So in terms of increasing levels of anxiety and depression, there is a very strong connection in the literature. And so organizational leaders need to be aware of that risk and that vulnerability and to take some proactive steps to address them before they become problematic.
Hmm. I say, the microaggressions, yes, they're called microaggressions, but when they build up, I call it like death by a thousand cuts. I mean, it literally is these microaggressions can build, and it's not just an individual's psychological well-being, it's also the impact on their how they're showing up in the workplace, how they're interacting with colleagues and their leaders, whether they feel that they can contribute or not. I mean, everything that we know about bias and how that impacts organizations certainly applies to Islamophobia. And I think it's important we should actually define Islamophobia and address some of the misconceptions around it. So you and I, of course, have talked about this. This is fear against individuals of Islamic faith, also often intertwined with xenophobia. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that and then also talk about the intersectionality components of Islamophobia?
Sure. I think it's important to lay the foundation or groundwork for what we're discussing today. Um, Khalid Badoun defines Islamophobia as an exaggerated fear. a hatred and a hostility toward Islam and Muslims. It's perpetuated by negative stereotypes that result in discrimination, the marginalization, and exclusion of Muslims from America's social and political and civil life. So, the thing I want to point out in that definition is the phrase exaggerated fear. And what that means is that Islamophobia is not normative, and it's not rational. And so I think it's important for us to recognize the challenge that goes along with addressing it. Um, and so we can also talk about two forms of Islamophobia, one being structural Islamophobia and the second, private Islamophobia. Structural Islamophobia, rather, extends the fear of suspicion of Muslims to policies that are built on the notion that the Muslim identity is antithetical to American values, and then it poses a national security threat. And so policies that are based on that premise that Muslims are dangerous and can't assimilate into American culture, then that leads to some policies that limit Muslim American civil liberties and reinforce tropes of Muslims as dangerous and un-American. So examples of this, the Patriot Act, which allows for surveillance of Muslims without probable cause, the Muslim travel ban, those are examples of policies that are rooted in that stereotype that Muslims are dangerous and can't assimilate into American culture. Private Islamophobia is sort of your general everyday fear and suspicion of Muslims by individuals in society. And so they include both religious and racial slurs that refer to the Muslim identity. Examples of this are anti-Muslim protests or rallies, hate crimes against Muslims. And so, as you mentioned, it's important to talk about the intersection of racial identity, ethnic identity, and religious identity. So often in discussions on Islamophobia, we see a conflation of one's ethnic background with their religious background. And I think that is very telling because it highlights the fact that Islamophobia is deeply connected with xenophobia, which is the fear or bias against people of a minority racial identity. And so I think that it's important for us to examine that intersectionality. So there's generally an assumption that all Muslim Americans are from the Middle East or from Southeast Asia, such as Pakistan and India. In actuality, Muslims have a variety of ethnic backgrounds from many parts of the world, and they present with a diverse racial features. So not all Arabs are Muslim, and not all Muslims are Arabs. There
Mhm.
are Arab Christians, Arab Jews, there are Black Muslims, white Muslims, Asian Muslims. So it's important to recognize that one is an ethnic and racial identity, and the other is your religious beliefs and practices. So we don't want to, we want to separate the two, even though they're often conflated in media.
Yeah, and I think you raised a very good point in that, Muslims are represented in all different types of skin colors, to be very precise, right? So they're light to dark, just like other types of ethnic individuals. I think it's important for you to that the point that you made related to that not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Arabs. And so and I think the other piece to understand is that there's the intersectionality of religion and faith, then country of origin, and then there's identity, and then there's race, right? Because you have individuals who are Black who are Muslim, and you have individuals who are very fair and blue-eyed who are Muslim. And so that's an important thing to understand because we do see that bias sometimes, or stereotypes are based on how a person presents. And so that's really important to understand. And then I think it's also important for us to kind of talk about some stereotypes. So you've mentioned a glaring one, right? That Muslims are dangerous. And again, many of us understand that majority of Muslims are not, but it's important to recognize that these biases exist, these stereotypes exist, and that they can influence how people act and treat each other in the workplace, right? Or the statements they make. So we know one of them is that Muslims are are dangerous. That's a stereotype. Uh, what else would you say are stereotypes?
Sure. So I would add to that that Muslims are hold values or beliefs that are inconsistent with American values and beliefs. So even though a Muslim American may be born in America or Muslim citizens have become American citizens, um, it's important to recognize that the stereotypes that are prevalent cast Muslims as opposing or can't be aligned with the American values. And so that promotes the marginalization and the othering and exclusion of Muslims in society. And then, of course, that plays out in the workplace. Another common trope of Muslim Americans or Muslims in general is that the hijab or the headscarf worn by some Muslim women is a symbol of oppression. That is a very common trope or stereotype that Muslim women are oppressed. And so it's important to recognize that the hijab is a symbol of modesty and that's essentially what it represents. And even though there is some debate about whether wearing the hijab is obligatory or a choice, um, women typically choose to wear it. And so in America, you will find some Muslim women who wear the hijab and some Muslim women who don't wear the hijab. And so I think it's important to recognize that either choice is is fine and is a part of that woman's identity, and that there shouldn't really be a value judgment based on the wearing of the hijab.
Mhm. Uh, I think you and I also talked about the perception that the stereotype that Muslims may not be clean. Is that right? Is my recollection correct? Could you share more about that as well?
And it goes back to colonialism,
Hmm.
where there were strong beliefs of the Arab as other, as living in the desert, as unclean, as uneducated, and so those tropes continue to play out, even though we are far away from that historically,
Hmm.
and yet those still permeate media depictions. If you look at cartoonists and caricatures that depict Muslims, you can see some of the things that I'm talking about.
Hmm. Hmm. I want to add for our participants, if you have questions, by all means, add them to the chat box. We will try to get to them all today. So let's talk about the manifestations of Islamophobia, specifically in the workplace, right? So we've talked about stereotypes. Stereotypes impact how people think, how people react, what people say, what they don't do, what they do, etc. So let's talk about how this plays out on work. What do we see? I mean, obviously there's exclusionary behavior. What else? If you could describe the impact in the workplace.
Sure. So there are lots of different ways that it can play out. Most clearly, as we were just talking about, microaggressions, which can be very difficult to respond to or to address because they may be sort of veiled in jokes or in exclusion of a Muslim colleague from important meetings, an important email on a project. Being difficult with that person to work with, a variety of different comments about Muslim identity, connecting that to terrorism or extremism. We also see lack of accommodations for religious practices. So some Muslims who are devout need to be, if they are praying the 5 prayers a day, they need access to a quiet room, a prayer room. They may ask for accommodations during the month of Ramadan, when Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset each day for 30 days. And so uh, how it can play out in the workplace is a failure to recognize that these are important practices in a Muslim's life, and the accommodations. If you're making accommodations for any other group, for any other social identity, it's important to recognize that religious minorities are also a social identity. And I
So
just
I guess an example of that would be like if you give your employees the option or time off for, I guess, Good Friday, as an example, right? Would that be an example of what you're saying, an accommodation that may be afforded to certain types of employees from certain religions and
exactly.
Mhm.
And so we want to be sure that all religious identities are recognized, respected, that individuals who practice um, oftentimes need accommodations. And so even though we may not be familiar with when those holidays are, we workplaces um, need to recognize that this may be an important part of that person's identity. It's also important to recognize that not all Muslims practice in exactly the same way. And
Right.
so not all Muslims, even though, for example, alcohol is prohibited, that doesn't necessarily mean that every Muslim doesn't drink alcohol. And that, so it's important to recognize that just as it is in other faiths, people practice and hold the values and beliefs differently from one person to the next. And so it's important not to make assumptions about what someone's faith is or how important it is to them in their life and in their work life.
Yeah, I think the level of religiosity, right? In other words, the level of their practice.
For
Uh,
sure.
yes. I've also am aware that we might inadvertently not be inclusionary when, for example, or inclusive, I should say. For example, like food at company events, and you shared with me that you went to an event and all they had to drink was alcohol, and that you had to ask for water because, as you alluded to just a minute ago, some Muslims do not drink alcohol, right? We also know that a fair amount of Muslims do not eat pork, and so it's being cognizant of the fact of having diversity, like in what you're serving or what you're presenting or what you're offering. Is there anything more that you'd like to add to those kinds of things?
I will just say that I don't know that we recognize that impact because there are so many messages in society that Muslims don't fit in. And so this is another message that your identity isn't recognized. So I think it is very important to consider dietary restrictions, um, not holding lunch meetings during the month of Ramadan, where practicing Muslims won't be able to share in the meal. So it can be very exclusionary when we don't consider those things. And they do need consideration because Muslims represent around roughly 1% of the American population. Um, that means that a lot of times they may not be thought of in the plans for social events at work or other instances at work that might highlight how an individual is Muslim and then doesn't fit in.
Hmm. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that Islam is often viewed as an outdated uh, religion, or a religion that is intolerant of others. And yes, we know, as there are many other faiths, there are extremists and there are extremist views and there are extremist followings. But if you could just kind of you know, tell us more about how that's not really the majority, and elaborate a little bit more on that perception.
Sure. So, um, I want to address the first part of your question, which was a sort of mischaracterization of Islam as a outdated or primitive faith. That played out quite a bit in my research on Muslim youth and bullying. I was very interested in capturing students' experiences in the K through 12 setting. And one of the things that came up in the focus group, and this is oftentimes it occurs in social studies when discussing or teaching on diverse faiths. And so some of the kids discussed that their faith was presented as something that's primitive and not modern. In other words, that modern day Muslims don't exist. And so I think that is an important note to make because it devalues and mischaracterizes and then winds up contributing to sort of an erosion of that identity as being something that's acceptable in American society. The second part of your question relates to extremism, and I think it's very critical for us to think about how, for example, let's say, I mean, by definition, extremism means that the individual is not at the center of that population or holds the same values. And
Mhm.
so, but when we think about, let's say, for example, Christian extremism in the American context, we typically think about that as, wow, that's sort of a rarity. That doesn't really happen all that often. But when we, on the other hand, consider Muslim extremism, um, typically that the sort of stereotype is the assumption that the entire Muslim population ascribes to those extremist views. And so we need to adjust for these types of assumptions and recognize that, and in particular, there's been actually quite a bit of research by Institute for Social Policy and Understanding and Pew Research Center. They've provided some data on Muslim American views of extremism and violence, and the data are very clearly in the opposite direction.
Mm. And also just to kind of give a sense to how important this topic is right now, because we started out this conversation obviously about the rise in anti-Semitism and the direct correlation to the rise in Islamophobia. Recent statistics show that 74%, almost 75% of Muslims report experiencing discrimination. You know, that's here in the United States. And 65% report issues specifically in school and work settings. Now, they may not always bring it to anyone's attention, right? Because they may observe it or they may experience it and they just kind of, I guess, just move on, or I shouldn't, I don't want to imply move on is like it becomes a non-issue, but they don't necessarily raise it. But we know the stats are there that they are experiencing it. And, you know, discrimination is illegal based on religion and faith and national identity. So, you know, there is a correlation to the risks of discrimination occurring, you know, in the workplace. Is there more that you would like to add to that?
Sure, there are a lot of reasons why people don't report. First, depending on the incident, I think it's important to talk about the perception. In other words, some people may experience a situation and not perceive bias in the way that the interaction sort of unfolded, and other people may perceive that bias. And so the impact can be really quite psychological. So, what happens if a person reports? There could be retaliation. There could be, uh, a domino effect in that other colleagues who become aware of the situation or observe the situation, they may themselves engage in hostile acts or microaggressions. And so, a lot of times people don't want to, Muslim Americans that experience this don't want to rock the boat necessarily. A lot of times it's just chalked up to that is something related to that individual and it's less about who I am. But when it happens frequently or goes unaddressed, it sends a message that that person isn't valued and that hate or hostility towards that person will be tolerated and potentially is acceptable. So it sends a
Mhm.
very damaging message to the employee when nothing happens as a result of coming forward. And so that's another reason why people don't report, because sometimes they report and nothing happens.
Mhm. Mhm. We've seen the effects of that for sure. And I think it's also important to know some of the larger trends that are playing out. So we have seen uh, some states now pass legislation that, and it started with higher ed, obviously because of what we've seen on college campuses, but it's starting to, we see that there are trends extending to workplaces where states have started to pass, certain states, California being one, Ohio another, and I know that there's at least three or four others in the works where state legislators have passed or in the process of passing mandates that require organizations to address religious-based, faith-based, ethnic-based, and frankly, racial bias in their workplaces. So that is a trend in it, and it's always aligned to it is illegal to discriminate based on those characteristics. We now have the Trump administration in office. We know it's a Republican dominant Congress, and we know that Congress has been very focused on addressing anti-Semitism and by extension, Islamophobia. Again, the root being faith-based, religious-based bias, et cetera. So the whole point of this is to say that expect that these trends are going to continue as it pertains to religious-based, faith-based, this construct of requiring organizations to address this. It's no longer acceptable to not address it, and I expect that that's going to flow over into other states and other potentially other requirements. So I think I would like to transition a minute here to talk a little bit about what organization leaders can be mindful of and be thinking about. And I'll start this part of the conversation, Dr. Ansari, with the idea that it's hard. Organization leaders who hold these roles cannot be experts. It's very rare to find that they're experts in all faiths, all religions, yes, many do have training and experience levels of professional aptitude as it pertains to mitigating discrimination and workplace hostility and harassment, but they may not always recognize this Islamophobia, like they may not always recognize anti-Semitism when it shows up. And I think one of the important points to make is that it's not about how we as leaders necessarily perceive what's going on. It's really the impact that the employees who are reporting are experiencing. Would you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Michelle. The issue with any kind of aggression is, and particularly in the as a bullying expert, that's an issue that I think about a lot is intent versus impact. And so in the bullying literature, um, one of the important pieces of the definition is that there is a malicious intent. In other words, the person who is perpetrating the aggressive act wants to cause harm to the other person. And so when it comes to bias, and because biases can often be unconscious or implicit, I mean, that's what implicit bias means, is that we're not really fully aware of that bias against a certain group. So when we're not really fully aware of it, but we microaggress, we don't intend to do it, or sometimes we do, but in keeping with with the point I'm trying to make is that we can't always look at intent because the impact is what's important. Is that there has been harm done to the individual on the receiving end of that hostile comment or that microaggression. And so the impact is very important. So I think it's hard for organizational leaders to always be able to anticipate or easily recognize an Islamophobic comment. I think what's important is to rely on the experience of the Muslim colleague who is experiencing that, and rely on them to understand what the impact of the incident was on them. So, for example, if we take a scenario where, let's say, a colleague observes an interaction between a Muslim colleague and another colleague, a third colleague, and a joke is made about that person. Um, uh, oh, well, you handled that conflict pretty well for a Muslim. In other words, sort of, uh, relying on that trope of Muslims as being violent or dangerous. Um, let's say a complaint is made to HR, and HR, investigates. The person says, I didn't mean anything. I actually intended it as a compliment. I was complimenting their ability to resolve the conflict. It was just meant as a joke, and I really didn't mean anything bad. Um, but when you talk to the Muslim employee, they may say, I was insulted by that joke. And you may hear, well, that's not the first time that that person's done that. And so
Hmm.
being able to report, document, take action allows organizational leaders to understand if there's a pattern that is developing or whether this is just an isolated incident. And so taking action when an individual says that harmed me, that impacted me, the intent has less, it really shouldn't factor in so much. Of course, I mean, it can factor in, but it shouldn't factor in so much in terms of determining whether the incident was harmful or not.
Hmm. Unless it's blatantly obvious it was explicit. Well, obviously we're not including explicit behavior, explicit intent here. We're talking about, as you said, implicit, right? Where
Right. And your point is an excellent one, and we need to take a moment to sort of parse it out. The thing that we want to remember is that um, the the individual is experiencing a sort of harm to their identity. And so when we act, when some people report an incident and don't act when other people report incidents, it reflects that bias. And implicit bias, as I said, is something that's happening internally, and it's outside of our awareness. And so that's why it's so insidious. And the reason we don't see such high rates of uh, Islamophobic, like explicit Islamophobic speech, hate speech. We often more frequently see marginalization of individuals who happen to be Muslim, exclusion of Muslims in the workplace, leaving them out of meetings or um, projects or things of that nature, important
opportunities,
conversations.
promotion, all the things that we know are impacted by.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
it's less about the explicit calling out of a Muslim as a terrorist, for example,
Because
but
that's a very clear, actionable behavior, right? I mean, most organization leaders understand what you do in that situation.
but that's not the typical
Right.
experience. It's
Hmm.
much more covert. And so I think that's the thing to really recognize is that it's harder to identify.
Hmm. So I think what it's important to talk about at this juncture is, so what can organization leaders know, understanding that most organization leaders are not experts in Islamophobia and all these, right. So it's just understanding practices. Well, the first is, of course, we hear talk a lot about um, uh, helping your employees understand the what is faith-based bias and religious bias and the intersectionality of it. We here at BioSync have a whole module that Dr. Ansari is one of our experts, obviously on the Islamophobia part of it related to religious faith-based, and bias, combating that in the workplace with by fostering cultural humility, which I think is important to talk about. We also have a diagnostic tool as part of that. It's also important to look at policies, practices, and procedure. Dr. Ansari is one of our experts and in the live component with respect to that, and also what we call the 2.0 training, which is then elevating the training from the basics, especially for workplace leaders and things like that, related to how to mitigate this and be, and have more inclusive leadership practices. So she's part of our team in that regard. I think the other thing too is also remind individuals that your priorities around inclusion do extend to faith-based bias, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on what else organization leaders should be thinking about.
Sure. And the good news is that there are a lot of things that organizational leaders can do to be proactive and as well to have a plan in place for dealing with and navigating allegations of Islamophobic behavior or comments. So, of course, one of the most obvious ones is to shore up your inclusion practices. What is it that your organization is doing for, in terms of accommodations, in terms of trainings? Um, uh, what is your organization doing for other social identities? And are you also doing it for religious minorities? This is
Mhm.
not just something I often talk about in my presentations on this issue. This is not just a Muslim issue. This is not just a Jewish issue. This is about um, religious minorities and the xenophobia that goes along with being a religious minority often. All right. So they often go
Mhm.
together. So of course, inclusive practices that honor all identities. You may have some Muslim employees that are asking for accommodations for prayer or religious observance or for grooming or dress code. You may have Muslim employees that request an ERG. That is a fantastic way to support Muslim employees. Um,
I would even go so far, Dr. Ansari, is if, because it's not just religious based, it's also ethnic and race based, right? That's the intersectionality. So if you have an ERG group, for example, for Asian employees or Black employees or whatever, and you do have requests to have one for Muslims or in particular Muslims, recognize that it crosses both categories. It crosses both faith and it also crosses into race and ethnicity. So if you offer for in particular race for other types of individuals in your workplace, you do run the risk of potentially inadvertently having a discriminatory allegation if you do not provide that kind of um, resource, I guess would be the right way to say it, right?
Sure. And that is an indicator that we don't typically think about faith as a social identity. We think that that's something practiced at home or a value or belief system that doesn't really factor into the workplace. But it is a social identity, and I think it's one that often does not get recognized in DEI work as much as other identities. Um, so I think it's important to recognize that when people feel that their identity is recognized, or that it's respected, um, that and that an organization is honoring the diversity, the entire in its entirety of their population, that that's also reflected in practices and policies. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the second thing I will say is that and I think you've alluded to this already, is that organizational leaders may not be able to recognize or understand microaggressions or the more subtle forms of bias that may play out towards Muslim colleagues. And it's okay not to know that. I think sometimes it's important to recognize that, hey, I'm a little bit limited here. I don't have a lot of Muslim colleagues, but for the Muslim colleagues that are in an organization, what is that organization doing to support them? So you may not know what to do, and that's okay. But recognizing that limitation is an important first step, and recognize that with the proper guidance, you can really work towards cultivating an organization that honors all identities. Um,
Mm-hmm. And so we've talked about the policies, which you've just addressed. We've talked about training. We've talked about ERG groups. I think exposure and awareness. We know that the risk of microaggressions, exclusion, and those kinds of things, even discrimination or discriminatory or hostile behaviors, go down by people getting familiar with each other, right? So it's exposure, it's awareness. I know you and I, Dr. Ansari, have talked about the importance of, if you recognize other, uh, ethnic or race, months or holidays or time periods, that might be a good time to think about how you can include some events or things like that to encourage exposure and awareness and dialogue. Do you have some ideas along those lines?
Sure. So the research evidence is very clear that there are two major antidotes to bias. And as you said, the first one is exposure. Again, because the Muslim population really only represents about 1% of the American population, it is often the case that many people don't know one Muslim in their community, neighborhood, etc. And so, being exposed to people who are different from us, and that difference can be anything from race to religious identity to gender identity, etc. So that exposure is very important. And we know that with exposure, bias, well, it works through fear, reducing fear, right? So the more that you're exposed to an individual and they don't behave in threatening ways, then it starts to diminish that fear of them. Well, this person's actually a good person. And so then with the next Muslim that you meet, you may say the same thing. And so through that exposure and those positive interactions, we can sort of counter the prevailing the media-backed trope that Muslims are dangerous. And then the second thing that is an antidote to bias is having an openness to learn about people who are different. And that's that cultural humility piece that you mentioned earlier. And so, with a genuine willingness and desire to know people who are different from us, we then develop a growth mindset around, that learning. And so you can understand or say to yourself, I may make a mistake. I may mispronounce this person's name. But if I show them that, I respect them and that I'm afraid to make a mistake, maybe they'll be willing to, teach me a little bit about the things that, their values and their beliefs. And guess what? They're probably going to be very similar to everyone else's, in terms of faith communities. And so I think it's important to stress that organizations have to create those learning opportunities. They have to, through trainings, through ERGs, through the ethos that the organization has around DEI work is really important. And so these are evidence-based strategies for dealing with bias in the workplace. And I mean, the reality is that religious diversity can be a challenge to manage in the workplace. Um,
Boy, isn't that the truth?
yes, but the research
When
evidence,
we've been accustomed to hearing, we don't talk about right, we hear two things. We don't talk about religion, we don't talk about politics. So guess what? There's a lot of conversation going on around religion and politics. It's happening in the workplace.
it
That's
is.
flowing
But
over. Yes.
But I think it's important to understand what conversations are relevant in the workplace, what is to be gained by having those conversations, and if a workplace recognizes or says this is something that's important to us, recognize that it may be a very difficult conversation, and you may need help with those types of conversations, and so that guidance can be very important. Um, but I think organizations that are, and it's not that I think, the research evidence suggests that faith-friendly workplaces also have employees who report greater life satisfaction, greater workplace satisfaction, greater retention, and less turnover. So the evidence is pretty clear that accepting and respecting people's faiths can really go a long way in terms of that person feeling that they belong. It also says that it sends a powerful message that about the core values that an organization has and how they view and respect their employees.
No question. So, Dr. Ansari, as we wrap up here, what are some of the major days, holidays, days of religious importance that workplace leaders should be aware of?
Sure, that's a great question. Like the Jewish calendar, the Muslim calendar is on a lunar basis. And so that means that important religious holidays will take place on different days every year. So now we are seeing more frequently Muslim holidays being reflected on our typical Gregorian calendars. And so I think that we can anticipate some Muslim holidays, and those are the two main holidays are Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. And so there are sort of markers, and there's some anticipation of when those will be.
And
The whole,
when typically around time period they fall in the year? Just
so
roughly.
um, Eid al-Fitr happens after Ramadan. And so Ramadan is the holy month where there is a spiritual and physical cleanse. And the celebration after those 30 days are up are called Eid al-Fitr, which is sort of a feast. It's a holiday celebrating the feast. Um, and then
And is that like in the springtime? And I'm trying to remember my awareness of when Ramadan is.
So right now, coming up, Ramadan will take place in the majority of March. I think it begins on March 1st.
Got it.
So, but every year it will move up by two
Sure.
weeks.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, understood.
So
Okay.
about approximately 90 days after Eid al-Fitr is Eid al-Adha. So those are the two main holidays for Muslims. And then, of course, the whole month of Ramadan is considered a holy time. So people may need accommodations because the fast requires that they not eat or drink during the day. So Muslims are often tired and they may not be able to focus as well during Ramadan. So some type of accommodations may be requested during that time.
Also an opportunity to celebrate, right?
Correct.
And
Yes.
introduce that into the workplace as an opportunity of cultural understanding, right? So some kind of event or doing something in not only just recognize making accommodations, but also creating an opportunity to a learning opportunity of some sort or exposure opportunity or right.
That's an excellent point. Absolutely.
Mhm.
It's really about cultivating that ethos, like I was saying, of respect, acceptance, and then we can move into celebration. Who doesn't want to celebrate?
Right. Who doesn't want to eat after 30 days of fasting?
Right. Well, I mean, you do eat at in the evening,
Understood. Yeah, in the
but
EU, right, but still. Yes. Um, uh, Dr. Ansari, you've been magnificent. And of course you are, because I know you very well, because you're one of our experts here. So just to kind of recap what we offer here at BioSync, we offer our addressing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and faith-based bias in the workplace by fostering cultural humility. If you know of us and our client, you understand we have training content. We also have a diagnostic. We have a cultural humility diagnostic called Culture Connect. We also have micro learnings because we are big believers in reinforcing what people have learned, all using positive psychology. We don't get into anything historical other than the history of religious bias as a concept. but we don't get into anything related to what's been happening in the Middle East or political things, those kinds of things. It's actually been very, very well received. And in addition to that, we offer layered on top of that, live training. That's the 2.0 I talk about. Once people have the foundational experience, more often than not, leaders take advantage of that, as well as our ability to help organizations with their policies, practices, and procedures. And I guess if I were to sum up this entire conversation, Dr. Ansari, I would say it's about um, education and openness, right? Openness to the desire to learn more, to be able to do more. I don't want to say do better, because it may imply that, some organizations are doing a terrible job. It's just, but do more. And go back to your core messaging and beliefs in your organization around inclusion, and just recognize that this is also important. Islamophobia is also important, and the inclusion of Muslims and individuals of the Islamic faith is important. Any other last pearl you'd like to leave our participants?
So I would just say that DEI efforts have to be a work in progress. It's not an endpoint that you reach. It's important to try to continue to make strides and progress in your core values of DEI. And I think that that's by a willingness to place that emphasis, you recognize that it's a work in progress. So continue to make strides, continue to do that good work, and adopt that growth mindset that I might make mistakes, but that's okay, because in the end, I'll learn from those mistakes and have a greater understanding of people who are different from me.
Wonderful. Dr. Ansari, always a pleasure. Thank you. We'll make this available on demand, and we'll also be posting this conversation that we've had here together on our YouTube channel very soon, as in most likely a couple days, as my team is hearing me behind the scenes say that. So thanks so much for joining, and we hope to see you for our next conversation next month.